On April 7, 1986, a garbled phone call came in to the duty officer at one of Leningrad's district police stations. All that could be heard on the line was heavy female sobbing and broken words, "Daughter, blood, hurry." The officer on duty figured out the address from the caller ID and immediately sent an investigative team to the location. The apartment was on the second floor of a typical Khrushchev-era building. The door was slightly open, and the lock and door frame were intact, meaning that the owners had opened it themselves. In the hallway, the investigators stumbled upon the body of Daria Mikiva, an 8th grader. She was still wearing her dark school dress, with a spring coat over it, and she seemed to be clutching the strap of her school bag in her hands. The medical examiner immediately noted multiple stab wounds in the chest and abdomen. The nature of the injuries made it clear that the killer had struck quickly and viciously, as if afraid that the victim would have time to scream. The traces inside the apartment gave the impression of a senseless, hysterical rampage. The drawers of the dressers were pulled out and lay on the floor, the doors of the sideboards were wide open, and dark spots of spilled wine mixed with blood splatters spread across the carpet. Forensic experts found signs of sexual assault on the girl's body. Not only had the usual items stolen in apartment burglaries disappeared from the house, money and her mother's jewelry, but also items of little value, a few children's books, a Rubik's Cube, a pale green plastic flashlight, and a couple of stuffed animals. Investigators immediately noticed this strange assortment. It seemed that the killer had taken whatever he could get his hands on, as if he wanted to take something as a souvenir. Two main theories were developed. The first was a banal robbery with elements of a sexual crime. The girl opened the door to a random stranger, who may have introduced himself as a postman or plumber. The second was more complex. Murder motivated by personal animosity, jealousy, or unhealthy attachment. This version was supported by the fact that burglars rarely leave so many priceless items in an apartment, but hardly touch trivial toys. This meant that the perpetrator could have known Dasha, had an emotional reason to kill her, and took items associated with the girl. The parents were initially excluded from the circle of suspects. The family was well off, there were no conflicts, and neighbors and colleagues spoke positively about them. That left friends and distant relatives. Investigators interviewed 96 people from the schoolgirl's immediate circle, classmates, neighbors, and teachers. Classmates recalled that on that day, immediately after the second shift, Dasha left school without her best friend. In the afternoon, according to one of the witnesses, Dasha was standing at her doorstep talking to her friend. Everything seemed calm, the girls were joking and laughing, with no signs of distress. But what happened after this meeting remained a mystery. None of the residents of the neighboring houses noticed anything suspicious. No screams, no noise, no strangers. This puzzled the investigators, especially considering the fact that many things had disappeared from the apartment, and to carry them away, the criminal would have needed several bags or sacks, which meant that one of the neighbors must have seen them. However, no one reported anything. It seemed impossible. Unexpectedly, the case took a new turn. A young resident of the neighboring building, Elena Rokotova, came forward to the investigators. The girl claimed that on the day of the murder, April 7th, she saw two young men running out of the Mikhaev's building. Each had a bag, and according to Elena, a children's kaleidoscope was sticking out of one of their pockets. This detail immediately alerted the investigators. It was precisely this toy that Dasha's parents had noticed was missing after searching the apartment. But what attracted even more attention from the police was Rokotova's statement that the suspects left the scene of the crime in a Volga car. In those years, it was not a cheap car and would be remembered by many. However, that was the end of Rokotova's usefulness as a witness. In the days that followed, the girl added new details to her story several times, each time changing them. First she claimed that the men were wearing dark jackets, then that one of them was wearing a light-colored jacket, and later she added that the second man had a mustache. The investigators began to doubt her sincerity. Their suspicions grew stronger after all the residents of the building, as well as the janitor on duty at the entrance, stated that they had not seen any Volga cars near the building that day, let alone suspicious men with bags. The investigators began to pay closer attention to Elena herself. The girl's behavior seemed increasingly nervous, and in the end, unable to withstand the pressure, she confessed everything. It turned out that there was no Volga, nor were there any men with a kaleidoscope. Rokotova had simply made up the story. Her motive was banal. She wanted to seem important, to participate in a real case, and, at the same time, under the pretext of helping the police, to get more freedom from her parents, to go out and spend evenings with friends. The police, unable to track down the killer of Dasha Mikiva, focused their attention on teenagers. They methodically checked minors who were registered with the police's juvenile division. There were more than 500 such individuals in the city and region. They also investigated boarding school students, children from psychoneurological clinics, as well as neglected and homeless children, anyone who did not have an alibi for the period from April 7th to 10th. Particular attention was paid to those who had previously been caught under the influence of alcohol or drugs, as well as those who had been observed mistreating animals or exhibiting increased aggression. In order to find at least something from what had been stolen from the Mikhaev's apartment, investigators combed through rooms in the dormitories of nearby vocational schools and technical colleges, searched basements and attics, and questioned dozens of janitors, and security guards. At the same time, another line of investigation was pursued, checking people with previous convictions for sexual offenses, hooligans, troublemakers, and people with mental disorders who were registered with psychoneurological clinics. However, it was all in vain. The criminals seemed to have vanished into thin air. The investigation reached a dead end. And then suddenly, another crime occurred. Just a month and a half after Dasha's death, on May 20, 1986, the city was shaken by another horrific incident. 5-year-old Masha Vostriakova was found dead in one of the districts of Leningrad. As in the previous case, the girl's body was discovered by a neighbor who was concerned that there had been no sound or movement coming from the apartment for several hours. Again, there was no sign of a break-in. Everything indicated that the child had opened the door to the killer herself. The state of the apartment resembled that of the Mikhaevs: scattered belongings, missing valuables, and missing children's toys. This time, the criminal apparently did not abuse the child. No signs of sexual assault were found, but forensic experts found traces of biological material on the bedding. Based on this, forensic experts were able to determine with certainty that the perpetrator was male and, most importantly, that he had left the same type of DNA as in the murder of Dasha. But there was another detail that linked the two crimes. On the floor in the hallway, right by the front door, there was again a footprint from athletic shoes. Without any direct evidence, investigators began to analyze all similar crimes that had occurred in Leningrad several years before the murder of Dasha Mikiva. Among the many cases, one that attracted particular attention was the attack on a boy who miraculously survived a brutal beating. His description of the attacker matched the characteristics established earlier: a young man of medium height, thin build, wearing sneakers with distinctive white stripes. It was this element of the footwear that attracted attention. Traces of such sneakers were found in both Mikiva's and Vostriakova's apartments. In fact, this was the first element that linked all three cases, two that ended in murder and one that failed. The difficulty lay in the fact that the crimes took place in residential areas far from the city center, where the density of buildings is high and the level of surveillance is low. In addition, the perpetrator acted mainly during the day, when most adults were at work and children were often left home alone, especially those whose parents worked shifts or had rotating schedules. Random passers-by rarely remembered who entered a particular building, especially since the criminal, as it later turned out, knew how to behave quietly without arousing suspicion. Investigators began to thoroughly examine the property stolen from the apartments. The killer took not only money and jewelry, but also, at first glance, useless things: children's toys, flashlights, Rubik's cubes, and most importantly, books. This circumstance stumped the investigation. However, one of the detectives, who had a literary education, noticed an interesting detail. Some of the missing books were rare editions that were extremely rare in libraries. For example, the Vostriakov family lost 19 volumes of the Library of Adventures and 6 volumes of 1001 Nights, published in Dushanbe in the 1970s. Such books were almost never found in regular sales. It was decided to involve employees of second-hand bookstores, libraries, and consignment shops in the investigation. Lenknigtorg, as well as regional retail chains, were sent descriptions of the books with a request to inform the police if anyone tried to sell such publications. The results were immediate. Within 2 weeks, 17 reports were received from store employees about attempts to sell books from the Adventure Library series. Unfortunately, None of the sellers who were investigated had any connection to the crimes. They were either elderly people getting rid of their home archives or students in need of money. Meanwhile, anxiety in Leningrad was growing. The murders of children became the subject of heated discussion in queues, at bus stops, and on public transport. Parents were afraid to let their children go alone even to the store or school. Rumors about the mysterious child killer spread throughout Leningrad at an alarming rate. The townspeople, shaken by the series of horrific crimes, discussed them everywhere, on buses, trolleybuses, and in queues at clinics and shops. It was in one such queue, at a grocery store counter, that a woman shared details of the murder of little Masha Vostriakova. Her words were heard by Raisa Solomenko, the mother of a 5-year-old son and an attentive neighbor. With each new sentence from the storyteller, a frightening memory came to Raisa's mind. An hour before Masha's murder, a suspicious stranger had already tried to enter their apartment. Raisa immediately went to the nearest police station and reported the incident. According to her, on the day of the murder, at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, someone rang the doorbell. Her son Vitaly went to the door, and Raisa heard him talking to someone. Listening, she realized that the stranger was offering the boy to sign up for the children's library, and then, hearing an adult approaching, began to explain incoherently that he just wanted to make a phone call. Raisa went into the hallway and saw a young man, thin, of medium height, dressed in jeans, a dark leather jacket, and sneakers with white stripes, the same kind of shoe prints that had been found in the apartments of the murdered girls. The young man, seeing the woman, became visibly embarrassed, began to fidget, changing the excuse for his visit on the fly, and then approached the phone and, according to Raisa, began to dial some numbers meaninglessly, more for show. After a few minutes, he thanked her for her help and left the apartment. Raisa remembered his face and mannerisms well, and according to her, the first high-quality photo fit of the suspect was soon compiled. However, even the appearance of the photo fit did not produce the expected result. Weeks passed, but none of the responses led to an arrest. The killer remained elusive, and the city lived in constant fear. Meanwhile, the investigation decided to focus on analyzing the items stolen from the apartments. The police believed that sooner or later the criminal would try to get rid of some of the stolen goods, especially rare books that were of interest to collectors. Thus, the idea of a large-scale search for traces of the criminal through second-hand bookstores was born. Advertisements appeared in newspapers, on the radio, and on television, appealing to the residents of Leningrad. If any of them or their acquaintances had sold or purchased rare editions, especially books from the Library of Adventures or 1001 Nights, they should immediately report it to the authorities. Particular attention was paid to the oldest second-hand bookshop, located on the corner of Lytiny Prospect and Zukovsky Street. This shop was famous for the fact that the most unique books were sold there. One day, a young man entered the oldest second-hand bookshop in Leningrad, located on the corner of Lytiny Prospect and Zukovsky Street. He was carrying a stack of books, among which the employees immediately recognized some rare volumes. One that stood out in particular was 1001 Nights, published in Dushanbe, similar to the one that had previously been stolen from the apartment of one of the victims. The young man filled out the standard commission documents, left his passport details, signed the reception register, and calmly left. One of the store employees, intrigued by the rarity of the edition, began to leaf through it and noticed strange brown spots on one of the pages, very similar to dried blood. He immediately picked up the phone and called the police. The investigators who arrived checked the passport details and immediately noticed the name, Mikhail Makarov, born in 1962. His passport photo was urgently compared with the photo fit previously compiled based on Raisa Solomenko's description. There was no doubt, the suspect's appearance matched completely. The decision was made to arrest him immediately. However, when the police arrived at Makarov's address, they found that he was not at home. According to his relatives, he had gone to the store. The suspect was caught red-handed when he returned with groceries. The operatives carefully detained him right at the door of his apartment. Mikhail Makarov was born in Leningrad in 1962. He completed 8 years of school, then vocational school, after which he served in the army. Upon his return, he found employment with the organization Lenjadrener Gospitstroy, where he performed low-skilled tasks. He was inconspicuous at work, and his colleagues described him as a quiet, somewhat withdrawn individual. He soon married and moved into his wife's apartment, where her parents already resided. It was here that his personality began to deteriorate. As would later become known from interrogations and psychological and psychiatric examinations, Makarov's mother-in-law put particular pressure on him. She constantly criticized him, accusing him of being unmotivated, of not being able to get his own apartment, of being incapable of anything. Quarrels were frequent, and the atmosphere was tense. All this accumulated inside him, turning into anger and resentment, which he did not dare to express at home. Books became an outlet for Makarov, but not classics or adventure stories, only detective stories, crime novels, and magazines about maniacs and crimes. He read descriptions of brutal murders, torture, and investigations with particular enthusiasm. Later, he confessed, "I watched movies about murderers, rapists, maniacs. I read about them and imagined myself in their place. I wanted to experience the same emotions. I wanted to know what it was like to kill a person." Makarov, feeling inner rage and at the same time morbid curiosity, acted calmly, as if following a premeditated plan. When the boy opened the door, the criminal politely asked him for a pen and paper, ostensibly to write down a phone number, a typical ploy that already hinted at the attacker's preparation and manipulative nature. While the child hesitated, the killer easily squeezed into the apartment and instantly closed the door behind him. This was the beginning of a terrible ordeal. He took out a homemade stabbing and cutting device made from a sharpened screwdriver and used it to strike the boy dozens of times in the head and chest with particular cruelty. However, even after the child fell, he did not stop. He began to extinguish cigarettes on the boy's body, checking to see if he was really dead. Little Igor, despite the hellish pain, pretended with his last ounce of strength that he was not breathing, so that the killer would think he was dead and not finish him off. Makarov, deciding that the child was dead, began to methodically collect everything in the apartment that was of any value to him: money, toys, clothing. At this time, the boy continued to lie motionless, every moment balancing between consciousness and fainting from pain and horror. After a while, having gathered everything he wanted, the criminal calmly left the apartment without even trying to cover his tracks. When adults entered the apartment a few hours later, they discovered a horrific scene: a mutilated, bloodied child, barely showing signs of life. Igor was taken to the hospital, where doctors fought for his life. He managed to survive, but he was left permanently disabled, both physically and psychologically. A couple of months after the first attack, Mikhail Makarov struck again, this time targeting 11-year-old Dasha Mikiva. He prepared in advance. As before, he chose a time during the day when the adults were at work and pretended to be a family friend. The girl, without looking through the peephole, thought that her older sister had returned for some forgotten items and opened the door. The criminal already had the souvenir knife he had found earlier in his hands, a small but sharp blade in a decorative sheath, which he had grabbed while searching the apartment. He stabbed the girl more than 30 times with this knife, mostly in the chest and neck. Before the murder, the girl tried to persuade Makarov. She offered to take the money and jewelry and simply lock herself in the bathroom. She promised to keep quiet. But the maniac did not listen. He acted cruelly and methodically, as if he were in some kind of manic trance. After the murder, as before, he thoroughly searched the apartment, taking jewelry, books, children's toys, and food from the refrigerator. He later confessed that he derived acute pleasure from the feeling of power over defenseless people. In addition to the child murders, Makarov also confessed to attacking an elderly woman, a veteran of the Great Patriotic War. According to him, he became angry with her because of her unpleasant tone. The woman had made a remark to him in the stairwell. He followed her, broke into her apartment, and beat her, but, finding nothing of value, left, leaving the old woman half dead. She later survived but was left disabled. Makarov hid all the stolen valuables in the basement of one of the residential buildings in the center of Leningrad. He would go there to spend a long time looking at his trophies: rings, brooches, bundles of Soviet rubles, Rubik's cubes, flashlights, and other toys stolen from murdered children. Sometimes he would deliberately walk near the crime scenes to listen to his neighbors' conversations about the mysterious killer, enjoying how people speculated about his identity and motives. During questioning, Makarov behaved in an extremely contradictory manner. At times he wept, insisting that he did not know why he had done all this, and at other times he described the details of his crimes with cold precision. He begged to be sent to Afghanistan, claiming that he wanted to atone for his sins with blood, fighting for his homeland. But the investigation regarded these statements as an attempt to avoid punishment. On November 27, 1987, Mikhail Makarov was sentenced to an exceptional punishment, execution by firing squad, with confiscation of property. Until the very end, he hoped that the sentence would be commuted and that he would indeed be sent to war as an expiator. However, in 1988, the sentence was carried out. He was shot in one of the cells of the Kresty detention center.